The warm evening air in Manhattan felt heavier than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. On the corner of East 76th, where limestone townhouses rose like fortresses of generational wealth, a young woman stood alone, quietly adjusting the strap of her worn leather shoulder bag. Her name was Macy Harper, and Dason. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged to the prestigious crowd gathered tonight for the annual Whitmore Langston private auction, an event known among elite collectors and curators as an exclusive gateway to untouchable art. Macy was wearing a pale lavender cotton dress that clung gently to her slender figure, a lightweight cream cardigan with sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and simple flat shoes scuffed from walking. Her hair, a soft auburn, was pulled back in a low, imperfect knot, a few strands framing her delicate face. There was no makeup, no jewelry, no curated aesthetic, just grace, quiet and unpretending. She didn't walk with the weightless confidence of privilege, nor the rehearsed posture of someone used to being seen. Instead, Macy moved with intention, like someone who had learned not to disturb the air around her. In her hands was a thick ivory envelope with a silver embossed seal. The kind that could not be printed or forged, the kind that meant you had been personally invited. Macy approached the front entrance of the Langston Hall, its steps lined with low lanterns flickering in twilight. Two men in tailored black suits guarded the entrance, their earpieces buzzing with muted instructions. Just inside, behind an antique marble reception desk, a sleek young woman scanned names from a tablet while offering guests practiced smiles, but the kind that never quite reached the eyes. Macy waited patiently, her heart quiet but alert, watching as people in velvet gowns and double-breasted tuxedos flowed past her. A woman in emerald green with diamonds at her throat breezed in ahead, greeted by name. A gentleman with a silk scarf around his neck laughed as his vintage watch was admired by the hostess. It was a world Macy had seen from afar her entire life, and yet tonight she had every right to step inside. When it was finally her turn, Macy offered a soft good evening and extended her envelope. The receptionist's gaze dropped, then hesitated. Her fingers touched the heavy paper without fully taking it. She smiled, but it felt more like an apology in advance. "I'm sorry, are you with catering?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just confident in her conclusion. Macy blinked once, slowly, then answered quietly, "No, I'm here for the auction." She placed the envelope on the desk with gentle certainty, watching as the woman reluctantly opened it. The seal cracked under her fingers. For a moment, the receptionist read, brows faintly furrowed. Then something shifted. She glanced at Macy again, this time with suspicion rather than dismissal. Her lips parted as if to ask something, then thought better of it. "One moment, please," she said, and turned away, walking briskly through a side hallway. Macy stood alone at the desk. Around her, champagne glasses clinked. The scent of expensive cologne floated in waves, and the sound of laughter bounced off the marble walls. She wasn't nervous, but she was still. Not frozen, just observing, quietly taking in how easily people revealed who they thought belonged and who didn't. She saw the flickers of glances, the subtle head tilts, the slight widening of eyes when someone noticed her standing too long at the entrance. There was no confrontation, no scene. Just a soft wall of silence that formed when no one knew your name. A kind of passive rejection that didn't bruise the skin, but pressed slowly on the ribs. After several long minutes, the receptionist returned, now accompanied by a man in a crisp navy suit. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with slicked-back silver-streaked hair and a name badge pinned perfectly to his lapel. "Miss Harper," he said, not unkindly. "We weren't expecting you personally." The pause before personally was thin but sharp. "It seems there's been some confusion with registration." He handed back the envelope, now resealed with transparent tape. "Unfortunately, we are at capacity this evening, and only confirmed collector entries are being admitted." Macy looked down at the envelope. Her fingers curled around its edges, but she said nothing. There was no flush of anger, no protest. Only a small nod. "I understand," she said softly. And then she stepped away from the door, walked back down the stone steps, and turned the corner, vanishing into the deeper hush of early evening, leaving behind a world that had never once paused long enough to ask who she really was. The streetlights had just begun their nightly hum as Macy Harper walked along the side of the building, her figure folding into the shadowed brickwork like a brushstroke on a forgotten canvas. Her steps were not rushed, but deliberate, each one soft, controlled, as if the pavement itself deserved reverence. The sky above her was fading into that inky indigo that Manhattan wore so well, and the warm breath of early summer drifted through the alley, carrying the faint scent of blooming linden trees from a nearby courtyard. She passed no one. Only a quiet hum from the auction hall's rear-loading dock filled the silence, accompanied by the occasional metallic clatter of a service cart or the faint echo of footsteps behind sealed service doors. Macy stopped near an old wrought iron bench set against the back wall of the building, partially hidden beneath a rusting fire escape. She sat slowly, folding her hands in her lap, her bag beside her. No one asked her to move. No one told her to leave. She was neither seen nor unseen, just another quiet shape in the blur of a city always moving too fast to notice what wasn't shining. Across the street, the auction was beginning. From her position, she couldn't see the main hall, but she could see the reflection of its warm golden light on the upper windows. Music drifted faintly into the open air, a classical prelude, something baroque and bright. It contrasted deeply with the worn fabric of her cardigan and the calluses on her fingertips, and each earned through long hours of work that had nothing to do with orchestras or velvet chairs. Inside the Langston, waiters circled with silver trays, their movements rehearsed to be invisible, as if even the serving of food was part of the exhibition. Guests moved like practiced pieces across a social chessboard. Laughter floated in orchestrated bursts. Conversations tiptoed around art, legacy, and leverage. Names were currency, and introductions carried the weight of judgment. Macy knew this world, not from experience but from memory, filtered through the lens of her mother's stories, the long, rambling tales told on quiet Sunday evenings over tea and the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. Her mother, Rosalind Harper, had once painted in a cramped studio over a bakery in Brooklyn, her fingers stained with ochre and crimson, her clothes always dusted with pastel chalk. She had never been invited to any auction. But Macy remembered her whispering the names of places like Langston Hall as though they were mythic cities, unreachable, perhaps, but not impossible. It had been almost 2 years since Rosalind passed, a quiet death after a long illness, and Macy had barely spoken of it. Grief, for her, was not public. It clung to her in the way she carried herself, in the decision to wear her mother's old locket hidden beneath her dress, in the fact that she still checked the mailbox each morning, even though nothing personal ever arrived. And tonight, of all nights, she had not come for spectacle or status. She had come because she had seen something, an image buried in a forgotten PDF catalog, attached to a digital invitation forwarded from a private archivist. It was a painting, unnamed, unattributed, marked simply as portrait of a girl reading. Lot 47. The artist, unknown. Medium, oil on canvas. Condition, fair. Estimate, $60,000, $75,000. She had stared at the thumbnail for a long time before she clicked it, her fingers trembling slightly. And then she saw it, faint but unmistakable, the soft tilt of the shoulders. The left eye, slightly more almond-shaped than the right. The book with the broken spine in her hands. And just behind the girl's ear, the unmistakable blur of a flower painted over, perhaps by a later hand, but still visible beneath the years of neglect. It was her. Or rather, it was her mother's image of her, painted when Macy was 14, sitting on a wooden chair in the studio, reading a copy of Wuthering Heights aloud as her mother mixed color on a chipped porcelain plate. Rosalind had never titled the portrait, never signed it. And Macy had thought it lost forever when the landlord, after her mother's death, had cleared the studio without notice and sold the contents to a private collector. That was why she came tonight, not to prove anything, not to make a statement, but to reclaim a part of herself that had been stolen, even if no one else recognized its value. She reached slowly into her bag and pulled out a slim, battered tablet. The screen cracked along the top right corner. She turned it on. The battery blinked a dim green 12%. She connected to the public Wi-Fi spilling from the auction house, a trick she had learned long ago in cafes when she couldn't afford coffee but needed a signal. The loading was slow, the live stream buffering in brief increments. But eventually the image sharpened. The auction room came into view: high ceilings, gold trim, chandeliers like frozen fireworks. People seated in curved rows of polished wood, bidding paddles laid across their laps like weapons of privilege. She logged into the silent bidding system, using the credentials she'd received through the foundation. The only way someone like her could gain access was through a scholarship grant tied to minor holdings in a university collection. Her name wouldn't appear on any printed list. Her presence was digital, ghost-like, but valid. She had been approved, her deposit wired 3 days ago, drawn from a carefully guarded account that her mother had left, built not on wealth but on small savings, grants, and the slow, patient work of restoration commissions. She scrolled to lot 47. The time was approaching. 2 lots to go. Inside the building, in a room lit with the soft sheen of anticipation, the auctioneer cleared his throat, adjusted his cuffs, and gestured for the next item to be displayed. The air buzzed faintly with interest, though no one yet knew that something unusual was about to happen. Not a scandal, not a revelation, but a quiet shift in the weight of the room. At that moment, Macy sat still on her bench, the screen glowing in her hands, casting a faint halo on her face. She didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't speak. She simply watched, waited, and prepared to act when the moment came, not to demand entry, not to force acknowledgement, but to stake her claim through the only language this room respected, the weight of a bid. And when that moment arrived, she would not hesitate. The shift was almost imperceptible, like the tightening of air before a summer storm, but Macy felt it even from the other side of the glass and concrete, sitting on that cold bench as the night wrapped itself more tightly around the building. Inside the auction room, the auctioneer cleared his throat again, not out of discomfort, but to draw a subtle curtain between the previous lot and 18th century landscape that had fetched a polite applause, and what was to come. He adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but now shaded with mild curiosity. Lot number 47. He said, letting the words hang in the room with a practiced weight. An untitled portrait, oil on canvas, provenance unknown, medium repair, dimensions 20 by 30. Estimated value, $75,000. As 2 assistants brought the painting forward, there was a flicker in the audience, not recognition, but mild confusion. This wasn't the kind of piece the Langston auction was known for. No ornate frame, no signed lower corner, no provenance thick with baronial estates or 19th century French salons. Just a soft, solemn image of a girl reading, her expression unreadable, the background an unfinished haze. For many, it looked like an orphan, disconnected, unsponsored, an afterthought tucked among the heavyweights to fill space. But to Macy, watching through the gently shaking lens of her tablet, the sight of that painting filled her chest with such pressure it bordered on pain. Her eyes locked on the girl's face, the tilt of the chin, the book with its distinctive torn dust jacket, and she felt something like time folding in on itself. For a moment the city vanished, the hard bench beneath her ceased to exist, and she was again 14 years old, barefoot in her mother's studio. The sound of jazz on the old radio, the late afternoon sun crawling across the wooden floorboards. Her mother would murmur to herself while painting, not words but syllables, little vowel sounds of approval or focus, and Macy remembered trying not to move, then to stay in that moment forever, as if being seen, truly seen, could become something eternal. The auctioneer began the bidding low, cautious. "Shall we open at 45? He offered, and a hand rose quickly from the middle rows. A man in his 60s, heavy-set, wearing a tailored gray suit and a sky-blue pocket square. Another hand, more slender, rose from the left, an art consultant representing a mid-sized gallery, bidding on potential more than passion. 50. she said. 55, replied the first. 60. 65. Polite, contained, mechanical. There was no passion in the bidding yet, just the ritual, the surface theater of value negotiation. But Macy's fingers hovered over her screen, waiting, watching, knowing precisely when to enter. She let them circle each other for a few more rounds, and only when the bid hit 75 and the room quieted slightly, just enough for the auctioneer's voice to soften, as if preparing to close, did she act. Her finger tapped the button, place bid 80,000. There was no sound, no declaration, just a quiet alert that appeared on the auctioneer's screen. He blinked in mild surprise, smiled thinly, and straightened. "We have 80 from an online bidder," he announced. And the room stirred again. The man in gray frowned slightly, not irritated but suddenly alert. The consultant lifted her hand once more. 85. Average 85. The man countered with 90, but he now looked sideways, trying to locate the new player, though there was no face to track. Just an anonymous line of text on a digital screen. Macy didn't hesitate. 95. The consultant paused. The man in gray pursed his lips. 100, he offered, but it felt less certain. The auctioneer nodded. 100,000. Do I hear 105? Silence. From our online guest, 105. The consultant shifted in her seat, lowering her paddle. The man waited. 110? The auctioneer prompted. Nothing. Then, one last time, from Macy, 120,000. The room exhaled slightly. This was not the direction anyone had expected this painting to take. It was neither bold nor fashionable. But someone, somewhere, was bidding like it mattered. Not like it was a gamble, but like it was a promise. Inside the room, the auctioneer scanned the faces, though he knew it was pointless. Online bidders were shadows, often institutions hiding their purchases or international buyers delaying identity until payment cleared. But something about this particular escalation unsettled him, not in its size, but its precision. The digital bidder wasn't being aggressive. She was being careful, exact, and it made others wary. For pieces like this, bidding usually died quickly after the initial curiosity faded. But this one had climbed with the silent, unwavering insistence of someone claiming what was already theirs. The man in gray shook his head. He wasn't offended. If anything, he seemed slightly amused now, a touch impressed. He raised his hand halfway, then dropped it. No more bids. The auctioneer gave the customary pause, longer than usual. Going once, he said, and Macy watched him closely. Going twice. A long beat. Sold for $120,000 to bidder MH428, and a polite ripple of applause moved through the room. No one quite knew who had won or why, but the game had ended, and the room was already turning its attention to the next item. Outside, Macy sat motionless, the screen in her hand still aglow, the digital confirmation blinking. Purchase successful. Details will follow. She lowered the tablet slowly, her hands trembling just slightly. The painting was hers now, though in truth, it had always been. But what struck her most wasn't the moment of acquisition. It was what came after. She realized, sitting there, that she had expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, what rose inside her was something deeper, more complicated, an ache that didn't stem from sadness but from memory, from the finality of a door quietly closing behind her. In that room full of voices and opulence, no one had known who she was. No one had paused to wonder why someone would fight so hard for a painting deemed anonymous and unimportant. And in that anonymity she had found her power, not to be seen but to act unseen, not to demand space but to claim what was hers without ever asking permission. As she sat in the dark, the sound of the auction muffled by thick walls and marble, Macy finally exhaled. The portrait of a girl reading was going home, not because someone saw its value, but because she never forgot it. And perhaps that was the truest form of recognition there was. The quiet that settled after the bidding ended felt denser than before, as if the room had unconsciously recoiled from something it couldn't quite name. Inside Langston Hall, the next item was already being prepared. Another known artist, another pedigree, another safe investment for someone whose interest in beauty came second to return on acquisition. But in a far less visible corner of the evening, beyond the reach of champagne flutes and gallery whispers, Macy Harper sat completely still, her reflection dimly visible in the black glass of her tablet as the auction feed closed. Her hands remained on her lap, one resting lightly over the other. The pads of her fingers slightly reddened from the pressure she hadn't realized she'd applied during the bidding war. There was no need for movement now she had done what she came to do. And yet her body resisted letting go of the tension, as if something vital still lingered in the air. The street around her had gone quieter. Even the distant hum of traffic had softened, replaced by the occasional flutter of leaves or the mechanical hiss of a taxi decelerating a block away. Macy's gaze moved toward the top-floor windows of the building across from her, where the silhouettes of the auction's main gallery flickered like distant lanterns. She imagined the people inside settling into the rhythm of the evening again, already forgetting the portrait, already processing its sale as a strange little detour. No one there had spoken her name. No one had asked why someone would pay over $100,000 for a painting that didn't have a signature. She had entered the room like a shadow and exited with what mattered, and the absence of acknowledgement brought with it a strange kind of freedom, a freedom she hadn't anticipated would feel so bittersweet. As the silence deepened, her thoughts drifted not to the painting itself, but to the moment the brush first touched its canvas. She remembered the sound of her mother rinsing her brushes in a chipped glass jar, the way she would pause to tuck a stray curl behind Macy's ear while painting, murmuring softly, not with affection, but with the reverence of someone touching a living subject. Back then, Macy never understood the weight of being seen so clearly. As a teenager, she resented sitting still, being watched, having her silence interpreted. But now, years later, with that moment forever locked behind time, she saw it for what it was: love, yes, but also recognition. Her mother hadn't just painted a girl reading. She had painted a daughter becoming someone the world would never notice unless she made herself visible through something other than noise. Her mother had painted Macy's solitude as something dignified, not lonely. And now, that solitary presence had reclaimed itself, not through explanation, not through confrontation, but through a single irreversible act, a bid placed in silence and sealed in conviction. Macy glanced down at the screen again, but it had already gone black. The battery had drained while she was still lost in thought. She didn't mind. The confirmation had already been received. The portrait would be transferred in the next 72 hours. Insurance paperwork, transfer of title, courier arrangements, all of it already in motion. The process itself was bureaucratic and dull, but the act which she had done felt mythic. Not because of the money, but because of the choice. For years, Macy had lived within the shadows of systems she didn't belong to, institutions that required credentials she never sought, networks built on legacy and handshakes. She had worked in archives, assisted in conservation labs, touched canvases older than most countries always through gloves, always with deference. But tonight she had crossed the line that separated curator from collector, witness from actor. She hadn't asked permission to do so. She hadn't even asked forgiveness. She had simply taken back what had always carried her mother's soul. And it was here, in this stillness, that Macy began to feel the weight of what it meant not to be noticed, not to be praised, but to belong. Not in the way others defined it, with lists and lineage and whispered connections, but in the quiet, internal sense that something had shifted, not the world, but her position within it. She didn't need a room of strangers to clap. She didn't need a headline or a plaque. She had won not for recognition, but for remembrance. The portrait was hers again, and in it, her mother lived in brushstrokes, in unspoken thoughts, in silence that said everything. She didn't move for a long time after that. And when she finally did, it was not with haste or elation, but with the calm certainty of someone who had fulfilled something sacred, not just a purchase, not just a return, but a quiet restoration of what had been misplaced in a world too distracted to notice when beauty wasn't labeled. The middle of the night had arrived softly. And somewhere in that space between ownership and memory, Macy Harper stood up, not taller, not transformed, but whole. When Macy finally rose from the bench, the night had deepened into a softer, more secretive blue, the kind that made the street lights glow like distant fireflies and turned the windows of buildings into shimmering mirrors. The air had cooled, brushing gently against her skin like a breath she didn't know she'd been holding all evening. She moved without urgency, her bag pressed lightly against her hip, the now darkened tablet carefully tucked away inside. Though the weight of what had happened still sat within her, a still, calm gravity, her steps had grown firmer, more certain, as if each movement had found its rhythm again. Now that the thing long feared and long hoped for had finally been done. She wasn't walking away from the auction as much as toward something else entirely. She didn't yet know what that was, and only that it was hers. As she circled the building and reached the front once more, she paused. The entrance still glowed, warm and golden, the reception desk quieter now but still manned. A new hostess stood behind it, mid-conversation with an older gentleman about valet slips. A few guests were exiting, laughter trailing behind them like perfume, and the polished glass doors reflected them all like ghosts from another world. Macy didn't intend to re-enter. She had no desire to be inside. But she stood there, just for a moment, watching the rhythm of that curated space, its practiced elegance, its cultivated warmth. She wanted to see if it would notice her this time, not because she needed acknowledgement, but because now she had nothing to prove. That changed things. And it showed. At that moment, a voice came from just behind her, crisp and low. "Miss Harper?" It wasn't a question of suspicion, but rather one of surprise, maybe even curiosity. Macy turned slowly to face the speaker. A tall woman in her late 50s stood there, elegantly dressed in a tailored dark blue suit, a name tag subtly clipped to her jacket, Victoria Laird, Director of Curation. Her posture was dignified but not aggressive, the lines of her face sharp but softened by the manner of someone accustomed to talking around delicate truths. "I was just informed of your purchase," she continued, her voice level, controlled. "May I ask, what prompted your interest in Lot 47? Macy didn't flinch. She met Victoria's gaze calmly. "It wasn't interest," she said. "It was memory." The reply hung in the air like incense, unusual, unexpected, intimate. Victoria's expression shifted just slightly, a flicker of something behind her eyes that suggested a calculation had gone awry. She studied Macy more closely now, and for the first time that night, someone looked at her not as an outsider or a mistake, but as a puzzle that didn't quite fit any of the known frames. "Do you have a moment?" "Moment," Victoria asked, gesturing toward a quiet alcove near the side entrance. They walked together in silence. Once tucked away from the front doors, Victoria spoke again, her tone more careful. "You'll understand that I'm asking not out of challenge, but protocol. The piece you've acquired, it came to us anonymously, part of an estate liquidation. We were told there was no known artist, no family claim." Macy looked at her, eyes steady. "There wasn't, until now." Victoria nodded slowly, folding her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. "Do you know who painted it?" Macy didn't speak for a moment. "Then yes, it was my mother." That sentence, so simple and unvarnished, landed with the weight of a confession. Victoria exhaled. Not with exasperation, but with the kind of breath one takes after the sudden shift of a painting in its frame when the image comes into focus differently than expected. They stood like that for several moments, two women from different worlds now bridged by a single thread of paint and time. "Would you be willing to authenticate it?" Victoria asked finally, carefully. "We keep archives. If the attribution is accurate, we may want to revise the records." Macy's gaze drifted upward, toward the darkened edges of the building. I'm not interested in validation, she said. I just wanted it back. Victoria absorbed that, then gave a faint nod, one that carried, perhaps, the weight of years spent guarding value with rules, and now encountering something that didn't fit within them. You'll forgive the earlier oversight, she said, not as an apology, but as an offering. Our staff is trained to manage the door, not always to see what's coming through it. Macy gave a half smile. Not bitter, just quietly knowing. I understand, she said. You're not the first. Victoria didn't press her further. But she did ask, is there anything else you need from us regarding the transfer? Macy shook her head. No, just the painting. And then, as if remembering something, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She handed it to Victoria. It's not formal, but it's a photograph of the original studio where the portrait was painted. And a handwritten note from my mother. If you want to keep a copy for your records. Victoria took it without a word, unfolding the page carefully. Her eyes scanned the photo, dim lighting, easel, and a young girl blurred in motion. And then the note, written in careful script, she is the only thing I ever painted with both hands trembling. R. Harper. Victoria looked up again. Her eyes had softened. Thank you, she said, and this time there was no professionalism in it. Just something quietly human. As Macy turned to leave, a few more guests were emerging from the building. One of them the same silver-haired man in the gray suit who had bid against her earlier, caught sight of her. For a moment he looked uncertain, as if he were trying to place her. Then realization dawned. He didn't speak. But he nodded once, small and respectful. She returned it with a nod of her own and kept walking. She didn't need to look back. She didn't need to enter the room to make an impression. Her presence had already done that, not by volume or spectacle, but by intention. She had made her mark, not through confrontation, but through the simple, unshakable act of showing up for what was hers and refusing to be moved. That was the moment when something shifted, not in her surroundings, but in how they received her. No longer invisible, no longer a mistake, still quiet, still alone but no longer unseen. As Macy stepped away from the alcove, leaving behind the quiet understanding she had exchanged with Victoria Laird, she felt a stillness settle in her chest, not silence, not emptiness, but the clarity that follows when something long held inside has finally been spoken aloud. The evening air had grown cooler now, brushing her arms through the sleeves of her cardigan like a reminder that the world continued to turn even in the wake of intimate transformations. She didn't rush her steps. There was nowhere urgent to be, and yet she felt that something awaited her, still not an event or a confrontation, but a culmination, a truth that had yet to be fully seen, even by herself. Crossing the plaza, Macy glanced once more at the illuminated facade of Langston Hall, the way the light spilled from its upper windows like softened gold, refracted through crystal and centuries of curated tradition. There were fewer guests outside now. The evening was nearing its close. The last lots were being presented, the final flutes of champagne clinking faintly in waning celebration. Somewhere inside, the portrait that had brought her here was now wrapped, prepared for transfer, tagged and recorded. But she had not come all this way just to claim canvas and pigment. That was only the surface. The deeper reason was harder to name, though she could feel it now, rising through her with each step she took along the sidewalk. Halfway down the block, as she passed beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, she noticed a figure standing alone near a service exit, smoking a thin cigarillo, the ember flaring orange with each draw. It was the man from the auction, the one in the gray suit with the blue pocket square, the one who had bid against her without ever knowing who she was. He wasn't watching her, not directly, but when she neared, he lifted his gaze and nodded with a faint smile, not the kind offered out of politeness, but the quiet acknowledgement of a peer. She hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because this moment, too, felt like something waited. "You surprised a lot of people tonight," he said simply, his voice low and unhurried, the smoke curling around his words like punctuation. Macy tilted her head slightly. "Did I?" He nodded once. You knew exactly what you were doing. That painting, it didn't mean anything to anyone in that room. But you made it mean something. She studied him for a moment, then replied, It always meant something. They just didn't see it. He smiled more fully then, and for a second he looked younger, less sculpted by the expectations of wealth and position. They will, he said, eventually. Some things take longer to be understood. Macy gave a small nod of agreement, and as she turned to leave, he said one more thing, softly. She must have been someone remarkable. The way you bid, you didn't hesitate. Not once. Macy didn't turn back, but her voice was steady when she answered. She was, and I learned from her that some things are never for sale. Then she walked on, not with triumph, but with resolution. Not the glittering finale of a spectacle, but the deep, resonant sound of something fully realized. By the time she reached the edge of the plaza, the city had changed again, as cities do when night folds over them. Lights blurred, the sidewalks thinned, and the background noise of lives in motion grew softer. Macy stopped near a quiet fountain, its water gently trickling beneath the light of a half-moon. She looked down at her reflection, faint, fractured in ripples but still hers. In that face, she no longer saw the girl who had once been invisible in rooms like these. She saw someone who had carried memory into the realm of action, someone who had claimed the sacred without needing anyone's permission. This was the culmination. Not the winning of an auction, not the silent respect earned from a man in a suit, not even the transfer of a painting from one pair of hands to another. It was the knowing. The deep, irrefutable knowing that her mother's art had not disappeared into anonymity, that her love, once traced in oils and unfinished lines, had found its way home, and that someone had witnessed, that someone had remembered, and that someone had acted. Macy had crossed a threshold tonight, not just through doors that had once been closed to her, but through the far more important passage, the one between grief and restoration. And in that quiet space, under moonlight and water, she allowed herself a single fragile smile, not of victory, but of peace. The morning came without urgency, slipping in through the high windows of Macy's modest apartment like a guest too polite to knock. The light was soft, brushed with gray from a thin veil of clouds, and the city moved below her in quiet gears, delivery trucks idling at corners, early risers walking dogs, the first coffee carts rattling open. Inside, everything remained still. The cardboard crate bearing the shipping label from Langston Hall stood by the window, unopened. It had arrived early, just as promised, hand-delivered by a courier in a dark blazer who hadn't known what he was carrying and hadn't asked. Macy had signed without speaking, then sat beside the box for nearly an hour, tracing the grain of its taped edges, her fingers resting where her name had been printed in precise black type. She didn't need to open it immediately. She knew what was inside. Eventually, as the light grew bolder across the floorboards, she rose and carefully cut through the tape. The inner wrappings were pristine acid-free paper, archival phone corners, a handwritten note from the auction staff thanking her for her thoughtful acquisition. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the painting itself, now finally free from its years of displacement, resting in her hands like a returned memory. She set it gently against the wall and stepped back. There she was, the girl reading, her 14-year-old self caught in brushstrokes and silence, her eyes half-shadowed, her posture protective, her presence somehow eternal. It wasn't a masterpiece in the way the world defined masterpieces. It was unfinished, unpolished, but it held a life inside it, a knowing. And now, a home. She didn't plan to hang it right away. For now it would stay where it was, propped near the sunlight, a quiet companion as she moved through her day. The flat was small, just 2 rooms, sparse furnishings, shelves lined with books and paper folders, but it felt larger this morning, as if something once disjointed had been rethreaded. She made tea slowly, the way her mother used to, letting the leaves steep longer than necessary, watching the water darken. She sat by the window, cup in hand, watching the soft motion of clouds. There was no noise, no applause, no phone calls or letters of recognition. The world hadn't shifted, but something in her had. Later that week, she would bring the painting to the small community museum where she worked part-time, not as an exhibit but as a gift quietly, anonymously, as her mother would have wanted. She would leave it in the care of people who valued story over price, who believed art was meant to be held close by those who understood its silence. No press release, no ceremony, just a note folded inside the frame, in memory of the unseen and those who never stopped looking. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted her walls in amber and rust, Macy looked once more at the portrait and felt not ownership but completion. She had not taken it back to possess it. She had brought it home to release it. And in doing so, she had closed a circle not with words, not with announcements, but with an act of quiet reclamation. Some stories do not end in revelation. They end in return.